Very much. Thank you and good morning. I wish first to express my thanks to the President of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Archer, wherever she may be. Yes, Professor. And the Chancellor of the Academy, Bishop Sharonda, for your generosity in extending the invitation to participate in this plenary session on human trafficking. It's an honor and an inspiration to participate in this important plenary session, which is a powerful manifestation of His Holiness Pope Francis's compassionate and global leadership as a voice for those who are most vulnerable, and a beautiful example of the Church's ancient prophetic calling to preach good news to the poor. It's my honor to address you today as the President of International Justice Mission, which is now the world's largest anti-trafficking organization. Over nearly 20 years now, IJM has been able to serve tens of thousands of individual victims of human trafficking from the poorest communities in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I'm grateful for the invitation to share with the Academy something of what IJM has learned about the reality of modern-day slavery in our world, in the hope that we might contribute insight and encouragement in our fight together to end this crime against humanity. In keeping with Pope Francis's emphasis on the human dignity of every victim and survivor, we found that our most powerful insights into the problem have emerged from the experience of our local indigenous teams, as they have walked very personally with these tens of thousands of very poor citizens in our world who have been taken into slavery. IJM's undercover investigators have spent millions of hours infiltrating trafficking rings and slavery operations to find the victims of forced labor and sex trafficking, who are hidden away many times in the darkest corners of the earth. We've worked with law enforcement to secure rescue for these victims, and our lawyers have worked with prosecutors and police to secure convictions of hundreds of traffickers and slave owners. Finally, our social workers have walked with the survivors of these abuses over years of recovery and restoration through our aftercare programs. In the formal paper that I prepared for this plenary session, we've tried to set out a few of the key lessons we've learned from two assets that have emerged from our work. First is the real-world, real-life insights that come from the world's largest body of individual trafficking case files, which we have at International Justice Mission. And secondly, the quantitative findings that are now emerging from the unprecedented volume of data that we and our partners have been able to amass and analyze. In sum, we've learned, first, that the survivors of trafficking can indeed be restored to safety and strength. And secondly, that vast communities of millions of people can be protected from the scourge of trafficking. First, as this plenary session pivots today its attention to the issues of resettlement and reintegration of these trafficking survivors, our experience would simply affirm both the indispensable need and power of these services. In our experience, in the absence of comprehensive, high-quality restoration services, the vast majority of trafficking survivors will not be able to thrive or remain free. On the other hand, just as powerfully, we have found that with excellent aftercare services, trafficking survivors can not only survive the experience of violence, trauma, and degradation that comes with slavery, but they can thrive. They can thrive not only for themselves and their families in the long term, but they can serve an indispensable role in seeking justice for the perpetrators of these crimes. They can mentor other survivors. They can be powerful public voices in the fight against trafficking in their communities, and they can, in fact, become leaders in their communities. As we note in our paper, contrary to one might expect, in our companionship with and assistance to thousands of victims of slavery, both those in forced labor slavery and those in sex trafficking, IJM has found that with psychosocial support, physical security, and the assistance of our lawyers and social workers, many victims of slavery are not only able to are not only able to testify in court against those who abuse them, but they're actually eager to do so. Furthermore, particularly in the collectivist societies where IJM works, the altruism of testifying is often an incentive to participate, with victims feeling they're part of protecting others, part of preventing additional victimizations taking place against others. This is not to say that all survivors should participate in legal processes against perpetrators, and IJM strongly opposes engaging survivors in legal processes against their will. IJM also opposes conditioning survivor benefits on their willingness to engage in prosecutions. On the other hand, in our experience, more often than not, we observe that the very act of standing up in court and telling their stories, and frequently seeing perpetrators held to account for their crimes, has extraordinary healing effect on victims. They are believed, their suffering is acknowledged, and their heart's cry for justice becomes real as the offender is held responsible.
Could I interrupt for a second and just ask if we are going to have the PowerPoint or not?
Yes, but in a later section. Sorry, yes. We've tracked thousands upon thousands of trafficking survivors in the journey to restoration and full reintegration in their communities, and have tracked it longitudinally with data. And the success rate is extraordinary and deeply encouraging. And I'd specifically point to 5 lessons learned for successful survivor services. First, there must be a commitment to comprehensive services that meet the full range of restoration needs. Secondly, those services need to be provided with an objective, measurable accountability to minimum standards of care that set a clear and achievable bar that gives tangible, concrete definition for the achievement of restoration outcomes. Third, trafficking restoration services can and must include effective trauma-focused therapies and services. Fourth, it is possible to provide these comprehensive restoration services even in the world's poorest communities. And service providers and partners can be held accountable to meeting these minimum standards. We've witnessed thousands of trafficking survivors thrive under IJM individual treatment plans that are based on an individualized assessment of the survivor's unique experience and needs. These plans cover everything from medical care, including for many of our clients HIV treatment, education, life skills training, job readiness, job training, job placement, housing, and where possible, family reunification and community integration. Again, we've seen these services successfully and measurably provided in the poorest communities. 5, the long-term impact of these services must be and can be tracked over time to assess whether they have been truly successful. At IJM, we have developed and implemented an aftercare successful outcomes form that objectively measures whether the services provided to the survivor effectively contributed to the client's successful restoration and their ability to function in society in safety over the long term. This evaluation tool examines the full range of domains of care that are most relevant to restoration, namely economic empowerment, health protection, social supports, and trauma recovery. So the big lesson for us over these 2 decades is therefore clear. Restoration for survivors of trafficking is possible. It's possible for the victims of the most horrific trafficking crimes, and it's possible in the poorest communities, and it's possible at scale. The second big lesson I would like to have us look at this morning is that trafficking can be stopped. And once again, it can be stopped in very poor communities, and it can be stopped at scale. While the restoration of victims is beautiful and one of the most powerful pictures of redemption through sacrificial love and care, what we most yearn for is that these abuses would not have ever occurred in the first place. Accordingly, this yearning has turned our attention at IJM to the question of prevention. Can we not only restore individuals to safety and strength, but can we restore large-scale communities to safety so that the poor are effectively protected from these abuses in the first place? And beyond that, can we actually quantitatively measure whether or not slavery and trafficking are being stopped and whether or not communities are actually becoming safer? 5 years ago, there was virtually no data suggesting that such outcomes were possible or measurable. But at International Justice Mission, we've now seen that change. The methodologies are improving and the evidence is accelerating. And in the process, we've noted some critical insights. First, if the world is to stop modern slavery, it must clearly understand what drives slavery. And here things have gotten extraordinarily muddled. And as a result, a focused and coherent approach to global slavery has proved elusive. Slavery is, of course, a highly diverse and complex sociological phenomenon that manifests itself in a vast array of forms that emerge out of a vast variety of highly contextualized social drivers. Consider, for example, the following list of specific cases of slavery, and consider the enormous social complexity behind each one of them and how different they are from one another. Picture first a whole family held in bonded labor in a brick kiln in Pakistan. Now think about a 20-year-old woman being pimped on the streets of Atlanta. Now think of the child soldier in the Central African Republic. Now think of the Restavik in Haiti. Now think of the abused domestic servant in London. Think of the kafala system laborer in the UAE. Think of the child bride in Afghanistan. Think of the prison laborer in North Korea. Think of the disabled Albanian child forced to beg in Italy. Think of the coerced cotton laborer in Kazakhstan. Think of the Nigerian girls trafficked for sex in Greece, and the Polish men abused as construction laborers in Germany. The forces driving slavery in each of these situations are very different, and therefore the task of stopping slavery in each one of these contexts is very different. Indeed, we need highly specialized expertise in each one of these circumstances to understand the driving forces in each peculiar situation and to formulate the steps that would reduce the slavery in each case. As a result, when we convene a global sociology conference on ending slavery, it's not unlike convening a global health conference on ending disease. The conversation about remedies moves across vast etiologies because the nature of the diseases, their causes, and their treatments is mind-bogglingly diverse. Consequently, when we consider the scale of the problem of modern slavery, with the most credible estimates placing the figure at over 35 million now, when we think of that large scale, and then we are presented with a dizzying array of highly particularized subsets of the problem, it can seem rather hopeless to derive any coherent diagnosis of the large global problem that would give strategic priority to our approach. It seems that the global fight devolves down to 1,001 highly localized struggles against very specialized pieces of the puzzle scattered across the globe, and that there really is no way to seize large-scale victories in the global war because the fight can only be waged through 1,000 contextually complex skirmishes. Despite these appearances, however, our experience and the newly emerging data on global slavery suggests something quite different. While it is true that the forms of slavery in the world are highly diverse and suggest highly diverse solutions, most of the actual slaves in the world are in very similar forms of slavery. And these forms of slavery are driven by the same fundamental driver and thus vulnerable to a very large-scale solution. This begins to come clear when we ask the question, where are all the slaves? The world can be sometimes surprised to know that more than half the world's slaves are in 3 countries. In fact, nearly half the world's slaves are in one country, India. In fact, 70% of all slaves are in 10 countries. And fully 80% of the world's slaves are in 25 countries. By contrast, what percentage of the world's slaves are in the United States, Canada, and all the European Union countries combined? 1%. This is not to suggest that the problem of slavery is not serious and not at an intolerable level in the US, Canada, and EU countries. But it is a serious problem, and it does take place at intolerable levels in those countries. But it does focus our analysis of slavery as a global phenomenon to at least have these facts in mind. It's not unlike the world's strategic approach to the global AIDS epidemic. It's true that AIDS kills people in every country and that every country must come up with an urgent action plan to address the disease in their particular context. But for those seeking to address the AIDS epidemic as a global phenomenon, strategic analysis required that serious leaders focus their attention on a single group of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that accounted for 70% of the world's HIV transmissions. What was driving the epidemic there in places of vast transmissions? What would have the most leverage impact to slow the epidemic in these focused geographies of vast transmission? These were the strategic questions. Likewise, when considering slavery as a global phenomenon, the data urges us to focus some special attention on those geographic areas of vast slavery. And it turns out there actually is a single overriding cause for slavery in those parts of the world where it takes place on a vast scale. And that driver is impunity. What is distinctive about these 25 countries where 80% of the slavery exists is that they are places where the laws against slavery and trafficking are not actually enforced, and where people do not actually get in trouble for enslaving other people. The best example of this is, of course, India. Data indicates that in India, the country where nearly half of the world's slaves are, if you enslave a poor person, statistically in India, you're at greater risk of being struck by lightning than you are of ever being convicted and sent to prison for that crime. Impunity is not the only reason slavery exists in the world, but it is the reason it exists on a vast scale. Impunity, for example, is generally not the chief explanation why tens of thousands are in slavery in the US or Canada or in EU countries. As we would have seen, it's a much more complicated phenomenon. But impunity is the reason why tens of millions are in slavery in countries of vast slavery. And we believe this is actually good news, because you can end impunity. And when you end impunity, the vast majority of slavery simply goes away. Why is that? Because the vast majority of slavery is soft crime. That is to say, it's what we call crime of opportunity. Perpetrators commit the crime because they can. If you can get away with it, you enslave someone because it's an easy way to make money. But if you're seriously afraid you might go to prison for enslaving someone, it's no longer an easy moneymaker, and you stop doing it. Another way to explain this is to say that slavery is a crime of opportunity. It is highly elastic to risk. Not all crime is highly elastic to risk, but slavery is. And when there's virtually zero risk, the level of crime is very high. By contrast, crimes of severe social deviance, for instance, like pedophilia, take place at a low level, but are also not very responsive to risk. As the risk increases, it falls a little bit, but stays at a steady state. It's a compulsive behavior that doesn't drop off very much even as the risks increase. Similarly, crimes of desperation, stealing bread because you're hungry, for instance, are more common than severe deviance and a bit more responsive to risk, but still not highly responsive to risk because you feel you have to do the crime to survive. Crime of opportunity, on the other hand, is totally different, especially a discretionary economic crime of opportunity like slavery. Crime of opportunity is highly responsive to risk and drops off altogether when the risk becomes sufficient. As we shared in our paper, this has now been proven for the first time and quantitatively measured. We have measured trafficking fall off by nearly 80% and more in large populations when laws are actually enforced. So when the question becomes, in the countries where slavery is thriving, is it possible to fix broken enforcement so it actually enforces the law? In recent years, this has also been proven to be possible and measurable. Our sample size of demonstration projects are still quite modest, but the outcomes point to promising ways forward. In countries with track records of appalling law enforcement, we've proven it's possible to stand up specialized police units and fast-track courts, send traffickers to prison, and provide excellent survivor services that measurably decrease the levels of slavery. This work is extremely difficult and it takes deep and long-term investment, but we think the outcomes suggest game-changing approaches in the fight against slavery. They need to be replicated and scaled in places where slavery is thriving. Many times the world gets confused because almost all the victims of slavery are poor and uneducated about the threats of slavery and about their rights. And so we tend to think we have to end all poverty and end all lack of awareness in order to end slavery. As a result, we either, as a world, give up because that sounds impossible to end all poverty and to end all lack of awareness, or our approach is to try to harden poor communities with poverty reduction and awareness so that as the traffickers try to approach them, they are fended off by reduced desperation and a heavy awareness of what the traffickers are doing. In fact, we've spent vast sums on this approach, but we've never actually seen it measurably reduce slavery in ways that are quantifiable. Why is that? It's because the traffickers simply move on to an almost infinite supply of 2.5 billion poor people who are desperate and unaware. And the traffickers will go wherever they need to find them. We should, of course, seek to reduce vulnerabilities by reducing poverty and raising awareness, but these strategies cannot hope to succeed in the current ocean of impunity in countries of vast slavery. Think about malaria, for instance. 90% of all malaria deaths occur amongst the global poor, and so one might think that poverty causes malaria. Of course, poverty doesn't cause malaria, mosquitoes do. It's just that the poor don't get what the rest of us get, which is protection from mosquitoes. So it turns out, we now know you don't have to wait to solve global poverty to dramatically reduce malaria deaths. You just need to stop the mosquitoes from biting poor people. Likewise, rather than trying to end slavery in countries of vast slavery by ending poverty, which we should do but for other reasons, it is proven to be so much faster, cheaper, and more effective to get the traffickers to stop even trying to enslave poor people because they're afraid of going to prison. Recent data is starting to suggest, like never before in history, that strategic leadership in fighting global slavery can make decisive progress, as we've seen in our lifetime in the fight against global AIDS. Great progress can be made in ending slavery in countries of vast slavery by helping end impunity for those who enslave the vulnerable poor. Over the last 20 years, we've learned that the traffickers and slave owners are not brave people. But currently, in the countries where the vast majority of slaves are, they are walking around as concerned about going to jail for their crimes as you and I have been this week about being struck by lightning, which is not at all. Focused strategic prioritization allows leadership to change this. In confronting the AIDS pandemic, a focused global effort achieved extraordinary and life-saving progress against a catastrophic threat, and the church was a world leader in that effort. Likewise, in our era, perhaps God will give us a role in seeing slavery finally swept into the dustbin of history where it belongs, as impunity is also swept away. Thank you very much.